Welcome to a very special edition of the KrakCast. We have a guest in the studio this week. It's Rupert Socha of TVN, a journalist and friend of the show who has kindly agreed to come in and speak to us about a burning issue in Polish politics and Polish life in general, really. My interest in getting Robert on the show is long-standing. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you. When I saw the story about the cameraman, your colleague... Piotrek Walsowski.
Right.
Yeah, I just instantly thought we got to get Robert on here. It's about time we discuss the media landscape in Poland post 2015, and this gave me a good excuse to call you up and ask you to come on. So I'd like to start there by getting your take on what's happening with your friend.
Well, overall, I would say it's worrisome. I know Piotrek, the cameraman. I have known him for years, actually, and he has been my default cameraman for years. He's an outstanding cameraman. He's a graduate of the famous Łódź Film School. And, I mean, he's experienced, he's friendly, he's a great guy, and I've learned a lot from him. So, and to me, he's the last person on earth who might be a Nazi, actually. But in this case, of course, it's not so much about law, I think so. It's much more about politics, and the trend overall is, as I said, worrisome, because he was part of an undercover operation, a journalistic operation, actually, to disclose some bad behaviors, while it seems that he's getting punished at the moment because, of course, the prosecution decided not to call him for interview, but actually they didn't drop the charges. They still exist, and I think he's going to be investigated in a way. We'll see.
Could you elaborate on what this bad behavior he was trying to investigate is? What exactly he was trying to find out?
Yes, it's about a documentary which was aired in January this year. And my colleagues, I'm part of the program where the story was produced, the documentary was produced. I'm part of the Supervisor program. It's a weekly documentary TV program. And it was an investigative piece where my colleagues investigated basically a Nazi group. They were celebrating Hitler's birthday in a forest. There was a cake. They were marching. They were singing songs. They were making the Sieg Heil gesture. And my colleague, I mean Piotr, and my second colleague Anya, they infiltrated the group, which had taken them months until they got invited to the party in the forest. And
just to make it clear for our listeners, propagating fascism and Nazism in Poland is illegal.
It's illegal.
Publicly, anyway.
Yes, it's absolutely illegal. And they took part in this event undercover, recording everything with hidden cameras. And they did a documentary. They delivered a documentary, and there were some clues in the documentary. There is kind of tolerance towards this kind of behaviors from the authorities. It's a soft issue. I mean, it's about influence, but there were such issues, and the authorities and the prosecution decided to investigate the event, and they indicted the people who were part of the event. But at the end, after months, the situation flipped upside down, and an investigation was launched against my colleague, because one of the bad guy, let's say, accused him of making the Sieg Heil gesture, and some pictures mysteriously showed up on the web. So basically, yes, my friend was making the gesture, but it was part of an undercover investigation. And as I said, he's the last person on earth who might be accused of being Nazi. But I think it's not so much about law, it's much more about politics. I don't want to go deeper into politics because as a journalist, I have never covered politics directly. Sometimes it popped up in my documentaries from time to time, but I'm not a political reporter.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is to take a little journey back in time to explain for our listeners the kind of after the election in 2015 what the small media law was all about. On December 28th, 2015, this law gets proposed, and even before it comes into effect and is then successfully challenged, it causes a huge earthquake in the Polish media landscape. Would it be right now? I mean, you've got TVP being upended, the managers being changed. Can you give our listeners a flavour for what it was like to be a journalist at that time and what the kind of both sides were, thinking?
I have always thought that journalism or the media are about to hold those in power accountable and about giving a voice to the voiceless. But when a journalist or journalists praise those in power, praise authorities, and legitimize them in a way or their behaviors, I think it's not much about journalism, it's much more about propaganda. So those are general rules. I don't want to talk directly about the state TV, but in any TV, such an outlet like a state TV, it's a common value for every citizen, it's a bad situation when such an outlet, the director is a former politician or a former spin doctor, actually, because the state TV doesn't belong to politicians and especially to the ruling party members. It's a different situation.
Here, but if we have a state television network or radio network, how can it not be political? I mean, would you say that there should be a state television network?
There should be. There should be.
But then how can it not be political?
Yeah. There are many examples. Let's take the American PBS or the British BBC.
Okay, well, you're going to get a lot of people commenting on that. PBS, for instance, is not actually a government institution. It gets a lot of grants from the government, but It's not actually a government institution the same way the BBC is. Well, the BBC, a lot of people argue, is not very impartial. It's a lot of people blame it for being biased. And as well, the BBC, just like Polish broadcasters in Poland, people are forced to pay for it. Do you think that it's actually the role of the government to take money from people and have that money used to propagate views or media of any type?
I don't know where's the benchmark, but what I'm saying that in Poland, what's not a healthy situation is the situation where after elections, whoever wins elections takes over the public media entirely. So, in my opinion, there should be some kind of checks and balances to make the relationship more, transparent, healthy, things like that. Because it shouldn't work this way, that the state media or the state TV belongs to the politicians or to the ruling party.
It's also a shockingly clumsy piece of legislation, the small media law. Listen to some of the things it's supposed to legislate for. Supposedly the national broadcaster is in charge of preserve national traditions, patriotic and human values, whatever that means, contribute to fulfilling the spiritual need of listeners and viewers, respect the Christian value system, strengthen the national community. You can't write laws like that, and that's it's ridiculous.
I can understand the intentions, and I might even agree with part part of that, but it shouldn't be actually a state broadcaster. In other words, if that government or that party wins, then that means they have a mandate. They can spend some money on creating some programming at direction, but not actually controlling.
But we already had a constitutionally protected system that had lengths of terms that ensured that it was longer than your length of term in the SEM, so there was no real prospect of one party, and we've lost that now. And it seems TVP has been.
But I think that the thing is that if we want to be part of the Western world, we have to stick to the rules. And one of the main rules
do we want to be part of the Western world? And what do you mean by the Western world? Sorry, am I putting you on the spot here? But I think that is a legitimate question. What do you mean by the Western world, and what do you mean by being part of it?
Even officially, I mean, formally, we are members of the EU, which is perceived as part of the Western world. So if we want to be part of the Western world, the civilized world, we have to stick to the rules. And one of the rules is freedom of speech, and that's it.
I want to talk a bit about, I agree with that, Robert, absolutely. And, Peace went about this so clumsily and heavy-handedly. I often think that some of the times they do this to actually, because they know it'll be rolled back, and it's just to make a big song and splash about stuff and, dominate the airwaves for as long as possible. And, and I found it a very unnecessary, ridiculous way of going on. And it is true, isn't it? Via has caused a massive controversy by, basically constantly parroting Peace's point of view on everything. Could it be said that, TVP has been, completely changed since these laws came in, that there's a massive noticeable difference in the nightly broadcasts going out? That's been, would you say it's been that extensive, the changes?
I think the TVP has changed a lot, and I have had some friends there, but I think it's less and less about journalism and about holding those in power accountable. So the key issue is what a state TV should be about. Should it be about entertainment, or should it be about accuracy, objectivity, things like that?
Exactly. And just because it can't be perfect, it doesn't mean you shouldn't try.
I think a state broadcaster shouldn't be about purely commercial issues. It should be much more about setting standards, about delivering accurate, fair news, things like that. That's my opinion.
I mean, in Ireland, RTE, our state broadcaster, is often accused of being overly liberal, and people give out about it. But at the end of the day, we all know that RTE is independently run, that the editorial boards have complete independence and no interference from the government. So we have enough faith in it that it mightn't be perfect in some people's eyes. I think it's fine. But, there is an awful lot of importance to these checks and balances. I mean, it seems to most Polish people think TVP now has become a bit of a mouthpiece for the government. I mean,
yes, but sometimes, I mean, a few weeks ago, I went to visit some friends. They live in a small village close to Krakow. And what they said that, there are many elderly in this village, and they watch mostly the public TV because it's for free.
This is true. We need to mention the fact that public TV in Poland no longer, it is not only available on cable TV and satellite TV, it's also just free to air. So if you have a TV, you can pick it up no matter where you are in Poland. They have the largest coverage. And especially people that can't afford any kind of other content, this is what gets to them. And it's also presented in a way that's very simple, very loud, this is good, this is bad, it's simplified. And it's something that people have been watching for years. It's the TV stations they've known since they were kids. So they implicitly tend to trust it.
Yeah, so, well, in my case, I had this privilege to spend 1 year in the US, and I have always followed the US media market because I think it's one of the most innovative media markets. There are many problems out there for sure, but I spent a year abroad on a fellowship, and I realized there that journalism or the public and free media may have an impact. And this is something important to me because I started thinking in a different way about my job and my expectations as well, because, I mean, the media are called the fourth estate. We shouldn't be part of the politics directly. Of course, media all over the world, they have owners. They are owned by the state. They are owned by private companies. But the core principle is the editorial side. I mean, the editorial side should be independent and should be transparent. A media outlet might be conservative, a media outlet might be liberal, but as a viewer or as a user, I would like to see how the process is going on. So I don't want propaganda. I would like to stick to the rules. I would like to stick to data, to facts. That's the key issue for me.
Yeah, and it's so important to note that as well. I mean, people talk as an example, about, big evil Rupert Murdoch or whatever, but nobody would question that the Times is independly, editorially stands on its own 2 feet, I mean,
because just building on that, because you just mentioned Rupert Murdoch, some time ago I finished reading a great book. Can I mention the title?
Absolutely.
It was Bad Blood, about a Silicon Valley startup. It's called Theranos. It's a great book, and Rupert Murdoch was connected with this story, and I realized that the guy had a style, because Theranos was. I won't go into details. Rupert Murdoch invested some $125 million into the startup. It was huge hype around the startup. But a Wall Street Journal journalist started to investigate the startup because it turned out that it was a fraud, a huge fraud. And the journal is owned by Murdoch. So Fox from the startup came to Murdoch and they basically said, hey, your guy from Wall Street Journal is investigating us and you invested a lot of money into the startup. You have to stop it. And he just said no. And he lost $125 million. But Wall Street Journal was able to deliver a great investigative story. The journalist was able to write a great book. And I believe a feature film is being made at the time. So you may say different things about Murdoch, because we still have in mind all those issues with intercepting people and surveilling people by the Sun.
The news of the world.
Yes, news of the world, right?
Which is no longer exists.
While on the flip side, you have this case with Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, absolutely, and I couldn't agree more.
When it comes to owners, you have Jeff Bezos, who owns Washington Post.
Yes,
but Washington Post, I believe, quite independently is able to report on Amazon as well.
And it's such an important principle when you talk about media ownership, because it's such a lazy, easy slur to throw, isn't it? These are German-owned companies, or Discovery is an American company, and it's ridiculous, really, because this is the case in every media company around the world. And as you say, the best publications are the best publications because of their reputation, because of the work they do, because of the journalism they produce. But I'd just like to touch on, and that's why people are so upset, I think, about the national broadcaster being used as a political football in this way, and the policies that have been brought in. But I'd like you to give our listeners who maybe wouldn't know as much about the Polish media landscape a bit of an overview of, just how vibrant, divisive, the magazine culture. It always struck me when I came to Poland first, the kind of political magazines, the sales must have been phenomenal. I used to look at the magazine shelf and I was thinking, back home that'd be all FHM and car magazines, and here it's all Newsweek and Fact, and so
in my opinion, it's quite diverse, and sometimes it gets quite partisan as well, because it's difficult to be just moderate, because you are always associated with the left, the right, although I don't think that such kind of compartmentalization,
or labeling,
makes the discussion easier, but that's the case. So on one side you have Gazeta Wyborcza, which is the most popular liberal daily, established by people from the Solidarity movement. So actually by some kind of activists. in the beginning. There's this ongoing discussion whether journalists should be activists, but it was a different situation at the time. While on the other side, you have some smaller outlets from the right side and different owners. You have also foreign capital in Poland when it comes to the media. TVN is part of Discovery, actually, a US global media company, and the German money is present as well in Poland, especially when it comes to some websites and newspapers. So I think it's pretty diverse, and this is what I can say. You can see the general trends that. The general trend that print is in decline, like almost all over the world except India, probably. And there's this key question: what's the future of quality media or quality journalism in Poland? Because newspapers are losing They are losing their revenues, they are losing readers and users. And the question is whether Poles would like to pay for such content. Gazeta Wyborcza is developing their paying option, subscription.
Gazeta, sorry to interrupt, Robert. I have to ask about the Kursky brothers, because that Yaroslav is Gazeta, and just so our listeners know, it's a famous example of the kind of the left-right divide in Polish politics. Right. His brother runs TVP, Jacek, which is
right. They're basically on different sides of
Christmas
the
dinner.
And I don't know them in person. But I believe I don't know what their personal relations look like, but I think they are not great because both outlets, Gazeta Wyborcza and Telewizja Polska, are not friends, I would say, because they are on different sides of the political scene.
Can you imagine that, like a family argument being like presented through media outlets? So like an article here, a TV program there, and it turns out and now we have to explain this to mother why we're not speaking to each other.
But I think that's a great example of the general divide in Poland, or the gap, the political gap. And I think it's the same in many countries all over the world. The same is in the US, in Western Europe as well, that there is this kind of gap between, let's say, the left and the right, and liberals and conservatives, because we don't talk to each other, we don't hear our arguments. And especially this digital media world doesn't help in it, because we live in our filter bubbles, and that's a problem. And especially when it comes to elections, big cities are mostly, Americans would say, are mostly liberal, while interior is more conservative. I think it's not good for the system to have this kind of, big disparities, this kind of gaps, social gaps as well. Something is broken because we don't listen to each other. I think so.
I often wonder, it's just a theory of mine, Robert, that, because the late 90s and the 90s were dominated by centrist versions of left and right parties, that were actually running on a pretty broad, centrist platform leading up to the financial crisis. It seems to me, since the Great Recession, politics is what I hope taken maybe a natural correction to its vicious left and rightism, and hopefully maybe, in each political system, what is needed is really a strong centrist figure to kind of bring people together around ideas that can actually benefit everybody. There seems to be an awful lot of name calling and pot shot taking in Polish politics at the moment. I was just wondering, do you see peace losing the next election or winning it maybe?
I don't know. Honestly, I've seen many things in my life, so I wouldn't risk such prediction. You never know, because sometimes at the end of a campaign, something may happen, something may pop up. You never know. So I wouldn't say that.
I think at the moment in Poland, we see the absence of a kind of like convincing or even charismatic opposition to peace. I mean, as much as we can deplore them or not, as the case may be, once Donald Tusk scurried off to Brussels, the civic platform was moribund, really, as a political force, as far as I can see, anyway.
I mean, I think I've said this on this show a few times before, is that one of the main problems of the opposition is they don't actually present any counter-arguments. They don't actually say, this is our proposition, let's do it this way. They just say no, which means that anybody who's not exactly sure about which side to be on just sees them as being negative or contrarian without actually being suggesting anything positive. So they're not winning anybody over, which means they're slowly, over time, losing interest. I mean, having people lose interest in them.
I think you're right, because on the opposition side, it's difficult to see a consistent leadership or a consistent idea to gather people around. I remember a few months ago, I was in Warsaw and I passed by the protest in front of the Supreme Court. I didn't participate actively because I think as a journalist I shouldn't do it, but I was just standing on somewhere in the back, just watching, and I was listening to the people who were on stage, supposedly opposition politicians or people who were criticizing the ruling party, and my main takeaway was that it was kind of of inconsistent mix. I mean, I couldn't see a consistent idea, a leader. I mean, you could find there everything. You could find there women's rights, feminists, unemployment. You could find there everything. I'm not saying that those are not legitimate issues. They are. But if you want to build an opposition movement, you have to have an idea to build on it.
And that's why we appreciate you coming in to talk about these issues with us face to face, right? But the more of this type of conversation that people are having, the more middle ground they find and the more they can cohere those ideas. I hear a lot from Polish people that the age profile of the protesters is high. It's older people who remember the struggles for democratic freedom that are most animated by the protests. I'd like to get your take on that. Do you see perhaps a little laziness in the younger generation, or are you not sure about that one at all?
It's being said that they lean towards right quite often, but honestly, I don't feel like an expert on this issue. But what's interesting to me is this issue, how journalists or the media behave when it comes to mass opposition protests and when it comes to opposition in general, because there were journalists who took active part in those marches, in those protests, and there's this ongoing discussion whether it's appropriate for a journalist to be part of such a protest or not. So in my opinion, it's not appropriate, because we are journalists, and even if we support a protest, a movement which is about freedom, about democracy, kind of general rules, there is usually a moment when such a movement should be channeled into a political action, and then actually you may find yourself in between or part of a political action. So in my opinion, it's not a good idea for journalists to be part of such movements. We shouldn't be activists, and I like the expression the editor of Washington Post once said, Marty Baron, that we journalists are not at war, we are at work. So in my work, I always try to stick to facts, to data, I'm just trying to do my work. So even because mostly I do investigative pieces, investigative documentaries, and sometimes politics pops up in my documentaries. So I just don't care what kind of a politician it is. To me, it's important whether he or she is corrupt, whether he or she broke rules, things like that. And I think we should stick to this kind of rules, and we are not activists, and we shouldn't fight with politicians as we were politicians, because there's this issue quite visible in the US, where some people call that the media or we journalists, we should fight with Trump and so on. I heard such voices, and I think that it's not a good idea to do it. Of course, there is this other idea what the media or what journalists should do if they are attacked directly by a politician or a president. Should we be part of the fight, or should we try to stay on the side? So, in my opinion, we have to always try to stay on the side and not to be part of the story, not to be part of the fight, and especially a political fight. So we are not at war, we are at work. And the issue is quite visible in such circumstances like war, for example, because a friend of mine, she's a Ukrainian journalist who was born in Donetsk, and now she lives in the US. But I remember she was telling a story when the Russian-Ukrainian war broke up a few years ago in Ukraine, in Donetsk. I mean, actually not a war, this kind of hybrid war, let's say, but
proxy war, I think, is
proxy war.
Little green men,
misunderstanding with guns.
Yeah.
Yes,
and thousands of dead people.
Those small green people. Yes. But we know what was it about, and she had this kind of a problem because he was a war correspondent for a Western media outlet. She is Ukrainian, and according to her, some Ukrainian journalists were saying we shouldn't report bad things about Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah, excessive fight.
Because we are patriots.
Yeah.
We are Ukrainians. We shouldn't report bad things about Ukrainian soldiers. And she said such a thing that we shouldn't care about it. We are reporters, so we should report the truth. And if Ukrainians do something bad, we should report it. So the opposition was, no, we shouldn't report it because we are patriots, we are Ukrainians. So in this kind of extreme situations, you can see how it works. Should we be, let's say, patriots, or should we be journalists? I think in such situations, we should be journalists because it's our job to report without fear and favor, and just deliver the truth and hold those in power accountable.
And on that note, I honestly think we can't do any better than that, Robert. I think, what you've laid out there, I couldn't agree more with you. That is a manifesto for any young journalist to follow. And I think what you've said is important. It was clear.
Because, every authorities everywhere, they want to hide as much as possible. Mm-hmm. Always. Be it national security or, you can always find an explanation. Let's say you shouldn't report on this because it's about national security and things like that. I think journalists shouldn't care about it. We should uncover as much as possible because authorities will always try to hide as much as possible. So our job is to be on the opposition side and uncover truths and lies, because authorities will quite often tend to be corrupted in a way. The longer they rule a country, mm-hmm. the more they will tend to be corrupt, especially without free and and independent media.
And I like that you're also willing to hold your counterparts in the media, will hold them accountable to the highest of ethical standards as well, because I think that was very important in what you were saying there, is that, you know, it's important for journalists to be journalists, to have that credibility. I'm sorry, you can't go on the march, you know, you put your Constitution t-shirt away and get to the facts, you know, and present it that way, and that's how you're an ally to constitutional democracy, not by getting out on the street and being part of the story, you know. I agree with you completely. On that note, I think we should end our wonderful tour through the media landscape post 2015. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our guest. Thank you, Robert.
It was my pleasure to be here.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you.